Campbell. I'm the director of the Latino Latin American Studies program here at St. Ben's and St. John's University. Tonight's event is the first in our fall 2019 series on the theme of social movements in the Americas, power, rights, and resources. We hope you will join us also on October 2nd, when we will host campesino leader Later Valencia, who will present on eradicating peace, the other side of the Colombian war on drugs. And then again on October 23rd for a presentation by Dr. Elena McGrath titled, I Am Too Poor to Fear Death, Indigenous Miners and the Defense of Natural Resources in Bolivia. Social movements, in the broadest sense, are collaborative projects for building power to shape some dimension of the social, cultural, political, or economic status quo. In Latin America, over the past 2 decades, a wide spectrum of social movement activity has emerged from outside the traditional political system to challenge official power and private sector control over natural resources, to defend human rights, and to demand institutional change. Social movement diversity in Latin America can be viewed as public evidence of the failure of elites and neoliberal policymaking over the past several decades to adequately address a long history of pent-up social demands, many of them arising from the most exploitative and oppressive legacies of the conquest and colonization of the region, i.e., concentration of land ownership, racism, racial hierarchies, and exclusion based on race, the extreme labor exploitation, the economic, cultural, and political subordination of women, wealth and resource extraction by foreign interests, and the dramatic breach between rich and poor. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Michael Wilson-Bercelli. He is an activist scholar specializing in the political ecologies of violence and resistance in Latin America. Originally from Mexico City, he has served as visiting professor of peace and conflict studies at Colgate University, research mentor to first-generation students at University of California, Santa Cruz, journal reviewer, union organizer, student body president, creator and co-host of a news radio show, news editor of a print newspaper, community organizer, and freelance filmmaker. He is currently a writer for Reform Alliance. His academic work has appeared in the Journal of Resistance Studies, Peace Review, Feminist Review, and the Washington Post, among others. I would like to express my gratitude to my political science colleagues who are here, Dr. Christy Siver and Dr. Pedro dos Santos, for the generous co-sponsorship of the Global Awareness Lecture Series, and for their work in making it possible for us to host Dr. Wilson-Bercelli for a 3-day residency. I know many of you here have been able to engage him in dialogue as a result. Tonight he will talk to us about recognizing and confronting violence, the evidence from Latin America. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Wilson.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for that lovely introduction. I paid Bruce a lot of money to say those nice things about me, so hopefully you know I'm broke. By the way, let me just tell you how lucky you are to work with Bruce and Pedro, to have them as colleagues and as professors. I truly admire both of them. Pedro and I go back a few years, and I've always admired his work. I think you're very lucky, so congratulations to you. It's such an honor to be here. I've had an amazing time getting to know everyone I've gotten to know so far, hearing about your work, and learning with and from you. Thank you very much for this invitation from the bottom of my heart. So I've been tasked with introducing Latin American social movements for this series. It sounds like you will have a great opportunity to deep dive into some of the deeper issues affecting the region. I thought the best way to introduce the series and to talk about resistance in Latin America in ways that are useful even for those of us who live outside of the region is to use this talk to think about exactly what it is that social movements are resisting in the first place and how. There are really important lessons there for all of us. Before I begin, I want to be a decent person and offer you a quick content warning. I'm going to discuss violence of different types, including sexual violence, and I'll have a couple of images that might be upsetting. The R word will come up. Nothing too gruesome, of course, but I'll have, for example, images of some Nazis waving flags, Nazi protesters. And anyway, one never knows what will trigger an uncomfortable response, which can range from acceptable to more traumatizing. So please know that it's okay for you to look away, to leave the room, I won't be offended, to catch your breath, and do please avail yourself of all of the university and city resources, as well as personal relationships and friends for counseling and support. So this is my agenda. I'm going to try to break up the talk into 3 segments and then leave as much room as I can at the very end so that I can hear from you as much as you do from me. I'll talk about what is violence really broadly. I'll try to ask you some questions about it. I'll talk really quickly about some of the Latin American social movements operating today, and then I'll end with some pointers about how these social movements help us to recognize and think about confronting violence. I want to start with an anecdote. In the early days of the Tambo Grande mining conflict, which was one of the studies I conducted for my research, for my dissertation, the Vancouver-based Manhattan Minerals Corporation gained state approval to begin exploration in the town. Tambo Grande residents woke up one day to see this perforator drilling holes near their houses and yards really loudly. So a group of them went to confront the geologists in charge of the drilling. "Get out of here! You have no permission to be here," the residents yelled. The geologists panicked. They were completely untrained in community relations or in conflict de-escalation. They quickly called their regional supervisor, who was staying in a regional capital half an hour away. When the manager finally arrived, his truck spread dust onto the scene. His white-collar shirt, blue jeans, gold watch, gold belt buckle, and crocodile boots contrasted with the simple garb of the locals. At this point, the man could have tried to reason or diffuse the situation in a big attempt to postpone the locals' claims. He could have reminded the local people that his geologists had state permission to be drilling this hole, these exploratory holes. But instead, in his coastal urban accent and with his light skin, he argued with the locals and began insulting them. "You're all nobodies. You're all shit," he said dismissively. Still arguing against an increasingly agitated crowd, the manager then began rolling up the sleeves on his white-collar shirt, as if he was ready to fight all of them. The confrontation eventually died down, but that night, a group of locals came back to set fire to that perforator. 2 different people, one activist and one of the geologists, told me this story separately. According to both of them, it was moments like this that slowly led up to a confrontation at the company's campsite, huge government and state police repression, arson at the compound, and the killing of one of the main leaders of the protests. Likewise, it was moments like this that sealed the fate of the mining project, which was ultimately canceled. These confrontations crystallized a key dynamic that has been understated in scholarly studies of violence over mining: the everyday interactions that build resentment and over time develop into headline-grabbing, explosive events. According to several databases, Latin America is the deadliest region in the world for environmental activists. At the same time, during my fieldwork and in my conversations with the people who shared their time with me for this study, I realized that while these databases were helpful in their focus on killings alone, they were missing many other forms of violence that are at play here: gendered, racialized, economic, ecological, structural, subtle, and everyday. These forms of pain, damage, coercion, and injury are missing both from a focus only on murders, as well as from headlines about violent protests, such as the arson depicted in this news story from Diario Correo. During the course of conducting my research, I realized that part of the problem with studies about violent protests was that scholars such as myself acted as if they could understand from a distance a headline like this, which framed the confrontation as violence committed by activists, without attention to their demands nor to the specific forms of protest that happened alongside this act of property damage. And in short, I realized that, in the words of Paulo Freire, it is not the tyrannized who initiate despotism. Here's another good example, a more recent one. A few weeks ago, here's where the R word comes in, underage woman, an underage girl, was allegedly raped by 4 police officers in Mexico City. Immediately afterwards, women started organizing, mobilizing, and they went out to the streets and they destroyed a bunch of stuff. They went into public transportation systems, the metro, the subway, bus stations, and they vandalized it, right? They marked it they even marked monuments with a lot of spray paint, for example. They committed a lot of property damage. And, of course, no doubt, you could rely on the Mexican media to cover the protests more than the actual incident that led to them. So here is a graph, and I'm sorry it's in Spanish, but I'll explain it to you. The yellow line is all mentions of the word rape in Mexican major newspapers from the moment of the accusation to the moment after the protests to when the study was conducted. And the white line shows the mentions of the property that was actually damaged during the protests. As you can see, the mention of the rape of the girl stays more or less constant throughout, but media increasingly reported on the property damage, right? The actual damage to stuff and not to this young person's life. So what is violence? I'm often provoked by this question. And I think this is a term that we often take for granted because we think we know it so well. It is such a recurrent aspect of life and media that we assume we understand it. But it is worth taking some time to think really critically about it. Do we really know? And how do we know? Is violence biological and evolutionary? Or is it something we learn socially? I had a good debate about this in a class today. I think we maybe are doing us a disservice by painting it as a false dichotomy here, because indeed it could be both. You can recognize that social practices cultivate instinctive behaviors, right? Such as fear or aggression, exacerbating them, often manipulating them, so that we respond to certain stimuli with fear, but not to similar other stimuli, depending on who it is that's creating it. We frame certain things as threats, but not similar other things. Like if a murder of an unarmed person is committed, we as a society are probably much less likely to judge it as illegitimate if the person who committed it was not wearing a badge. So here are two views on, or here's one definition of violence, and I'm going to give you two different perspectives about violence broadly. One perspective is that we should conceive of violence very narrowly, that it should be applied only to specific physical and intentional acts. Another perspective is that it could be applied to a lot of other things, even non-physical. As you can see, the World Health Organization here is restrictive. It wants to not only talk about physical force or power, but also about intentionality, right? I find myself more closely aligned with the second perspective, the more expansive one, because isn't symbolic damage capable of having psychological effects or harm? And don't those psychological effects manifest physiologically, for example, in poor self-esteem, poor mental and physical health, etc.? And aren't those forms of violence then that are structural, discursive, but also manifested physically? Do they not count? What about intention, right? What counts? Does intention matter? Here are some useful distinctions to help us think about this a little bit further. Aggression we can think of as angry behavior that is not necessarily harmful, right? Not all aggression is violent, but perhaps some aggression is definitely violent. Violence is the use of force to damage or injure, and that can happen in both physical, symbolic, and discursive ways, as we shall see. There are many layers and forms of violence. Admittedly, I struggle with the ability to operationalize such a general term. More specifically, Raymond Williams helps us out here. He warns that, quote, the emotional power of the word can be very confusing. I agree with that. He usefully identifies at least 7 senses. 1, physical assault. 2, use of physical force. And 3, the sense of portrayal, as in violence on television, which to Williams, quote, can include the reporting of physical events, but indicates mainly the dramatic portrayal of such events. You see the difference? Not only the content, but also how it is portrayed. Not only the content of the news story, but the news story and how it is given to you. It becomes much more difficult when we speak of number 4, violence as a threat. Number 5, violence as quote-unquote unruly behavior. 6, violence is a way to denote intensity, as in violently in love. Finally, it is also often used as 7, something that wrenches meaning from something else, wrenches significance from another thing. Today I will mainly adhere to the first 2 of these, which imply the use of direct physical force against living things. However, I will return often to the others, like the 5th, which really depends on how one and who defines unruly. And the 7th, because, as we will see, certain representations can cancel identities and reduce identities, foreclose alternative interpretations, prevent empathy, and thereby commit a form of discursive violence. So, now that you've learned so much, let me put it to the test. Is this a violent kitten? Let me get some answers about this. What do you think? Maybe 1 or 2 people. Is this a violent kitten? Somebody's nodding. Does somebody want to raise their hand? Is this a violent cat? Yeah, please.
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Why?
Because she's playing.
She's playing. Nice, good. What else? Is this a, but look at the claws though. And look at her fangs. Who else? Anybody? Is this a violent kitten? Or she just playing? No? Now you're just shaped by the first answer. No, please.
Because it's like harming the unliving toy.
Yeah, that poor turtle, right?
Yeah.
It's harming the poor turtle. Very good. What else? Yeah, please.
It looks like it's scared, so it might feel like it's trying to defend itself.
Excellent, very good. It's being provoked, right? And so now you're thinking about framing. What is and isn't outside of the depiction, right? You see somebody's hand there, maybe provoking this cat. Yeah, it helps us to think more broadly about what is framed and what gets left out, right? Any others? Please.
Well, you called it a kitten and not a cat. Cat is
Nice.
more threatening than kitten.
Very good, exactly. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, you're calling me out on my use of framing to set you up for this terrible question. Any others? Okay, so very good. Yeah, these are exactly the kinds of answers that I was hoping to hear. What about this? Is this violence? Insecurity? Can the environment be subject to terrorism? Perhaps a better term for this is subtle, slow, or everyday violence, in the words of Robert Nixon. What about this guy? Do you remember him? He's the guy who threatened to call ICE on employees and customers speaking Spanish in a New York City bodega. In this moment, he's getting in people's faces and wagging his privilege in front of them and saying, if you don't stop speaking Spanish, I will call the authorities on you to have you deported. Assuming that they're undocumented, which may or may not be the case, right? In this moment, he is embodying structural violence. Violence is structural as well as embodied. Structural violence, everyday and subtle violence, and direct physical violence are highly interrelated, right? They're in the same spectrum. He's using his privileged position to threaten people with being sent back to Latin America just because of the language that they're speaking. And he got in their faces to demonstrate his authority, to exercise his power, to put other people down, to prey on their vulnerable status so that he could make himself feel better. And so let's talk about Latin America. Central America, where he's threatening that these people should be deported back to, Central America is one of the deadliest parts of the world. El Salvador has the second highest rate of violent deaths, Honduras the 4th, Guatemala the 17th. And we are being told that these people are pouring into the US, quote unquote, because they're drug dealers, rapists, murderers, bad hombres. But the vast majority of the people coming to the United States come seeking refuge and asylum. Parents are taking their children and leaving everything else and everyone they've ever known to walk, raft, swim, hide in vehicles, risk all kinds of violence, etc. for 2,000 miles to get to our border and request refugee asylum just to get a free handout, right? To take your job. If you were surrounded by violence, underdevelopment, gangs, and no opportunities, would you stay? They are unsafe, so they're leaving everything they know behind. I think that's extremely courageous. I also think it begs the question of what safety and security mean. What is security? Here's a good image. I'm sure some of you have seen this making its rounds through social media. Note that there's a binary distinction, and we can question that. But I think the image is still useful to point out how security depends on who you are. Can somebody interpret this image to me? What does it tell you? What is the message here? In a few words, yeah, please.
It's kind of like what you think about every time you leave the house or you're gonna go somewhere that like you need to like keep yourself safe.
Yeah. And what is the difference here?
That I personally probably thought about every single one of those on that side.
And most dudes have not. They don't have to. Yeah, exactly. Very good. So think about this also. So what you're saying is that context matters. Who you are matters. Think about this also. For some people, for example, stepping into a minefield where there are a lot of undetonated bombs dropped by US-sponsored troops, for example, in El Salvador or in Laos or Cambodia, where there are more undetonated mines per person, there are more undetonated mines still than there are people in the country, stepping in your own backyard can be a source of fear, a source of insecurity, right? For some others, say a black person driving a car in the US, getting stopped by security forces is a source of fear and insecurity, right? It's not something that's comforting. It's not that they're here to help. What about people living in places where corrupt police and gangs rule with impunity, extorting, raping, killing, and disappearing people as they wish? There's clearly an everyday violence, an everyday sense of insecurity conveyed in stories like this, in images like this. Insecurity is an everyday phenomenon. Like violence, security is a really big term that we need to stop taking for granted. One meaning of security is unable to escape, right? It is secure, it is fastened. According to an older book, People, States, and Fear. The question is, what is security? Security is protection from some, quote, others. Who are they? How do these concepts of security get institutionalized, recognized, widely disseminated? And what do they do? What do they do? Let's think about that a little bit. Security and war are thought of as, quote-unquote, external matters, to defend from outsiders, threats from the outside. Are people threats to security? Groups? This is dangerous territory, of course. Remember, demagogues prey on fear and cultural bias, discrimination, xenophobia, fear of the unknown, the other, etc. The way threats are constructed, in short, is directly linked to historical forms of marginalization and oppression: race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, and so on. Who gets criminalized and portrayed as an enemy? More subtly, who is just too different? It's not that I hate them, it's just that they're a little too different, right? And therefore, implicitly, an existential threat. Keep this in mind as we proceed. Who is in, who is out, and in and out of what? And also remember that security is an industry, and it is incredibly popular. Your sense of fear and insecurity is massively profitable. So what effects could that have? Who benefits? Who wins? Who loses, economically and culturally? Here's a list of some of the corporations that ICE has spent more than $6 billion a year on contracts paying for private detention facilities, transportation, food services, etc., including Amazon and its affiliate Palantir, which collects, store, and manage information for ICE, which can access this legally, expanding its knowledge of and physical reach into the lives of undocumented immigrants. There's a lot of text here. What I wanted to say is that, just speaking of security, the people who are crossing the border without documents are not criminals. They are not meant to be treated as criminals. It's a minor offense, right? So they're being held, they're being detained while their status is assessed, and and to determine whether they will be allowed in or sent back, right? That's just the whole purpose. They're not criminals. But many of them are suffering all kinds of different abuse and violence, including children. We have more than 52,500 immigrants per day in a sprawling network of more than 200 detention centers across the country. We don't think or talk about it enough. So I know that we're talking about Latin America, but Latin America is in the US, right? So we need to think about this as well. So, what is violence? What is security? Now that we've gone through that, I want to ask you, do you support violence? This might help to answer my question. At a time when defending the environment is more important than ever, it also appears to be deadlier than ever. Understanding why and how to prevent this is a central motivation for my research. People nowadays refer to environmental activism as a suicide mission, particularly in countries that emerge from colonialism with weak, dependent economies and weak institutions. So, moreover, because local territorial dynamics are increasingly tied to international commodity chains, conflicts over natural resources transcend traditional ways of conceiving of locality and space. They involve and link people in various places, from the sites of extraction to retail, consumption, and waste. So for example, there is about $3 to $5 worth of gold in almost every electronic device, about $5 worth of gold in the device I'm using for this presentation. So do I support violence? Definitely, insofar as I'm reliant on this technology that is dependent on the violence that surrounds resource extraction. And remember, this violence is not only about murders. Peru is the world's 6th producer of gold, and it is also classified as one of the deadliest countries in the world for environmental activists. At least 270 people were killed, and 4,614 were injured between 2006 and 2016 in its social conflicts, the vast majority of which are specifically about mining. So this is what my research is all about. I'm happy to talk about it more during the discussion, and in fact I want to talk about it more because I want you all to cite it in all of your essays. But for now, I'll return to my question. Do we support violence? One of the findings of my dissertation is that one factor that is key in explaining violence and understudied is the role of attention in these localized conflicts over natural resources. Here's what I mean by this. Let me explain. Almost everyone I talked to said, when asked, that they disapproved of violence. However, when asked for further elaboration, most people can find qualified instances or contexts in which they feel that violence is justified. Self-defense, for example, national liberation, independent struggles against occupying armies, or even corporal punishment against your kids or against your pets, right? For some people, incarceration is a form of violence, but many of us are okay with locking people up. And of course, there are levels to this. So when you say to yourself that you don't support violence, think again. What I found was interesting, particularly in my fieldwork, was that even if they say they disapprove of violence, and even if they don't participate in it directly, almost everyone thinks and talks about violence, thereby negotiating its meanings and how it is understood. So at least discursively, people on various sides of conflicts were quote-unquote using violence to some extent. They used it as a framework to interpret reality, and when they discussed violent events, the attention these events drew also presented people with an opportunity to frame themselves, for example, as innocent bystanders or as victims of unjust circumstances. In short, violence, especially as a discourse, it's an opportunity to reframe public debates, and it is used strategically to generate symbolic and material benefits, to discredit one's opponents. Think about how, for example, anti-choice activists use the word baby killing, right? They're trying to make a medical procedure seem explicitly violent and criminal. Latin America is a productive ground on which to study these questions. The region has reportedly the world's highest rates of homicide, economic inequality, violence against women, and as I said before, killing of environmental activists. What is driving this violence, and how are people responding to it? So I'll talk about social movements now. Here's a brief definition. Social movements, according to some scholars, are organized, collective challenges to the status quo by people with common purposes and sustained interactions with elites, institutions, opponents, authorities, right? So think of the difference between a trend and a social movement. If all of a sudden Bruce starts wearing red chucks and then everybody on campus wants to wear red chucks, that's a trend but not a social movement, right? I could ask you why, but I'll just move forward for the sake of time so we can get to the Q&A. So these are some case studies that I'll cover today, really superficially, really briefly. Poor and landless movements, student and youth, women's, gender, sexuality movements, Afro-descendant and black movements, indigenous movements, conservative movements. I think I'll leave the conservative ones out, but I can talk about them in the discussion. And environmental and altered globalization movements. So here's an example of a poor person's movement or poor people's movement, the Piqueteros in Argentina. They're a movement of poor and unemployed people that by some estimates, it is mainly composed of women. About 74% of the members are women. They began as a protest movement mainly known for road blockades, but slowly expanded to form cooperatives where they have better markets. Where they have barter markets detached from the formal economy, food distribution, and skills building workshops such as in sewing. Many of them also participated in the quote-unquote recovered factory movement, where if a factory would be slated to be shut down, the soon-to-be laid-off employees would occupy their workplaces, barricade themselves against police coming to retake their factory for their bosses, and just continue working and producing. They took over their factories and just kept working, organizing themselves without bosses, sin patrones, running every decision through a workers' council that made all decisions collectively, horizontally. Another poor people's movement is the landless movement in Brazil. What they do is essentially they occupied unused land. They started taking over unused land because they were underemployed, unemployed, landless, and they needed to produce to feed themselves and their families. The 1990s presented an opportunity for them to do this at a larger scale because of the democratic return in Brazil, the end of the dictatorship. However, this was followed by neoliberal restructuring of the agricultural sector, which presented then more challenges. At the same time, the governments of Brazil became less conservative, more urban-based rather than rural-based, at least at that moment, at that time. So this opened, again, a space for rural organizers to work. Moreover, when they occupied a couple of places and led ongoing protests, the state sent police to repress them, which overwhelmingly backfired. They then became idolized in media and even are now glorified in some soap operas, or were glorified in some soap operas some years ago. I encourage you to look into the MST in Brazil. Here is an excessive amount of text. We don't have to go through it. But what is interesting about this, and it's an incomplete list, of course, but what's interesting about this is that the student movement in Latin America did not begin as it did mainly in the US in the late 50s, 1959 in Berkeley, in the 60s. They were agitating at least since the 1920s in Guatemala, for example. There's a long timeline and it's incomplete, and we don't have to go through it. But my main point is this. Why are young people consistently the protagonists in far-reaching, history-shaping movements for social change? What is it that makes young people do this? We can come back to these slides later. This is a student occupation at the Universidad de San Carlos in Guatemala in the 1970s. Here's another photo really quickly of that same protest, that same occupation. Let's talk about women and social movements. Women's movements are deliberate attempts to push, redefine, and reconstitute the boundary between the public and the private, the political and the personal. I hope we can talk about that later. Largely, they seek to dismantle gender inequity and build gender parity or justice. One major strategy for this, in a nutshell, and I'm being very parsimonious, is gender mainstreaming, quote unquote, which refers to the incorporation of gender analysis into all forms of life, into all action, into all social policies. Representation in media, how does that differently affect people based on their gender? A jobs bill, how will that differently impact people based on their gender? Food insecurity, climate change, how does that get affected according to your gender identity? That's gender mainstreaming, considering gender in all aspects of life. Masculinism, as you know, in Latin America as elsewhere, has a long, long history. After at least 300 years of colonialism, it is deeply institutionalized, as well as deeply ingrained in people's subconscious. Not in the US though, right? Here we trust women, we believe women. We only bomb other countries in order to liberate their oppressed women. So look at the art, for example, right? Who are the agents? And who are the students? And on whose bodies, for example? It's deeply ingrained. It is deeply, deeply ingrained. So how do you begin to erode something so deeply ingrained, so structural? There are a couple of ways, and one that's not in here is, for example, women are agitating for choice rights, for the reproductive rights, and the right to have a say on what happens to their own bodies. Another couple of them are the Ni Una Menos movement, not one less, which rejects high levels of sexual and gendered violence, which is also known as domestic or spousal violence, but I preferred sexual and gendered violence because it's not about where it happens, it's about to whom it happens. And also we should think of the growing relevance of indigenous feminisms, which are still marginalized, I should say, and reject and are fighting back against what is known as bourgeois feminism or white feminism. There are a lot of different people working on this through a number of ways. They are heterogeneous and diverse. They cannot be reduced to something so simple as what I have on this slide. But this broad field can we can find some commonalities between some of their trends, right? They posit, for example, that women play a vital role in the connection between society and nature, in the preservation and passing down of cultural knowledge, and in collective natural resource management. And they largely consist of a critique of both colonialism and the post-colonial state as fundamentally masculinist, misogynistic, and exploitative. And they are critical of neoliberalism and capitalism, which require massive resource extraction for its rupture, or for their rupture, of Mother Earth. They criticize capitalism for its rupture of Mother Earth, all for the sake of imperial accumulation, which they say only serves the white male elite of the world and marginally others, whereas at the same time it is most damaging to the indigenous women who live near the sites of extraction. So how are women fighting back against patriarchy and gendered violence, against everyday violence and economic inequity and so on? One way to do it is by fighting in the street, and through art, and building consciousness, right? Through painting, art. In addition to mass mobilization, this goes hand in hand with the important work of documenting and spreading information, right? Which spurs further mobilization and pressures for legal action, creates stronger arguments, more persuasive arguments that are backed by data. It all goes hand in hand. Legal strategies, documentation, information, and awareness, and building power and demonstrating strength through mass movements in the streets. Again, documenting the problem, using data to frame the debate, creating persuasive arguments, and demonstrating publicly to build power and exert pressure on authorities, on the media, on society at large. And I should say that protesting publicly is of course not the only form of resistance, right? It is about 5% of what social movements should do, or do. But it should be noted that it does have a hugely important value. Has anybody here been in a protest before? Raise your hand if you've been in a protest. Okay, so you might know that when you show up to these things, there's a kind of collective effervescence that happens. There's something really powerful about seeing that you're not alone, that there are maybe dozens, or hundreds, or thousands, or 500,000 other women who think just like you and who don't want to take it anymore, right? There's something really powerful about that, so we shouldn't understate it. Marching isn't everything, but it matters. There are many ways to do this. One other way is what this group does, and I encourage you to watch this video. It's on Vice, I think. Las Hijas de la Violencia, when they are catcalled in the street, they have confetti guns and they shoot it at the catcaller's face, and then they sing a punk song about sexual violence into their faces. It's a really cool idea, although of course we should note that there are risks to these kinds of actions, right? It's brave and very bold. Yeah, I encourage you to look at this later, or come ask me about it and I can send you the link. Another way to confront masculinism, of course, is by taking state power and fighting through policy and law and institutions. There are a lot of examples here, I won't go through all of them. The person on the bottom left did not win the election and actually ran as a conservative who rejected reproductive rights, so maybe she's not the best example here. But the key here is this. The power of people who take institutional authority in order to make change is diminished without a strong civil society agitating and pressuring for change from outside of institutions. Institutional change still requires street-level politics, organizing, advocacy, litigation, journalism, everything else. They go hand in hand and indeed are dependent on each other for success. The key is to be diverse. Here are queer, non-binary, and gender non-conforming movements. By the way, if you have confusion about these terms and you don't know how you should refer to people, just ask them, right? You can ask them politely. There are common challenges, for example, class divisions, right? There are people who organize in these movements who are upper middle class, who are not necessarily connected with poorer people who identify in the same ways. There are internal divisions, for example, that pick gay men versus lesbians, or gays and lesbians versus trans rights. The women's movement versus LGBTQ movements, for example, right? The AIDS crisis, which was profoundly devastating, and continued opposition from the church, the Catholic Church, and increasingly the evangelical church as well. Here's a timeline of some progress here. I won't go through it all, we can come back to it later. But it's interesting to think about how Cuba has shifted from being a place of hyper-masculinism in the first decades after the revolution to being recognized now as one of the most open and inclusive LGBTQ-friendly public health and education spaces of all of the Americas, especially after 2008. Also, I want to point out to the law passed last year in Uruguay. It provides trans people the right to get operations to match their sexual identity, along with hormone treatments, all of which are guaranteed right paid for by the state. The same law also commits the state to ensuring representation of trans folks in public offices by setting a minimum quota for such positions over the next 15 years. Finally, the law establishes a pension system, setting up a fund to pay for reparations and to compensate trans people who were persecuted, detained, tortured, and killed by the military. I mean, not for the killed, right? You can't compensate them, but maybe their families. People who were tortured by the military dictatorship between 1973 and 1985. The law was in the work for 2 years, since 2006, when the government recognized that 75% of trans people in Uruguay did not complete high school. The 25% of them were cut off by their families, leaving the trans population of the country about 873. So it's still a very small amount, right? But enough to want to pass a law about it, in particularly vulnerable and precarious positions. Again, Cuba's a really interesting case of change. We can come back and talk about it later. Afro-descendant and Black Latinx movements, or Black Latin American movements. They are fighting back really against a long history of marginalization. And I don't have to tell you the statistics about this. Really quickly, I'll give you one. In Colombia, the overall illiteracy rate stands at 6%, compared to 31% among Blacks. In Peru, the average number of school years among Afro-Peruvians is 6.3, while the national average is 7.3. So in short, they're not victims, they're fighting back, right? They're organizing, they're actively rebelling against the role of a victim and racial discrimination. They're fighting back against colorism and erasure. And an interesting question to ask about this is, does class trump racialized identity? Absolutely not, right? Because you could be rich Afro-Brazilian and still face discrimination all your life, right? And you should also note that I recommend you read Keisha Perry's book from 2013. She says, impoverished Black women are both at the bottom of the social totem pole, but also the backbone of the movement for Black rights in Brazil. There were major transnational anti-racist networks. This is another timeline that I probably shouldn't go through the whole thing. Let me skip forward a little bit because I'm already at 42 minutes. Indigenous mobilization. Why now and not earlier? There are, first of all, it's important to recognize that this isn't particularly new. Indigenous people have been resisting since the moment of colonialism, right? In the 1960s, there were guerrilla movements. However, most of the previous revolutionary waves sidelined or tokenized indigenous peoples and their identity claims. They were led by whites or non-indigenous campesinos. Now they're being led by indigenous peoples particularly. Why? Partly democratization, partly economic liberalization and how it made it so that the costs of market reform have been borne disproportionately by indigenous Latin Americans. And how neoliberal land reforms, for example, threaten communal land. This will encourage people to mobilize. Another thing is international factors. Their pressures have generated international institutional mechanisms to respond to specific needs, which in turn have facilitated their greater mobilization and inter-ethnic solidarity. For example, since the 1980s, their victories have created a whole corpus of international law to enshrine and expand their rights, from the UN Working Group to the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. Okay, so now I want to talk about how these are not separate tracks. I have purposely been feeding them to you as if they were, but there is no such thing as a separate track in real life, right? So it's worth to ask ourselves, are there movements in Latin America organizing specifically around the interaction between these identities, between various identities and constructs, like women, queer, non-binary, Black, indigenous, and poor? Yes, of course, there are tons of examples. Impoverished Black women at the neighborhood level everywhere are organizing if you look anywhere, almost anywhere, right? Indigenous feminisms are another good example of intersectionality. Queer, trans, black women's movements, for example, in Cuba. And the ongoing, quote, summits of indigenous women in the Americas, among countless others. At the neighborhood level, you can see this almost anywhere. Environmental justice. I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but I should just tell you that to make change about the climate, we need to think really intersectionally about this, because the climate doesn't impact everybody equally, right? And so if we want to make climate action, we need to think about who needs to be the leaders in this movement and how we can use climate action to account for other forms of oppression and violence. Okay, I'm gonna skip forward a little bit just to my conclusion so we can get to our discussion. So, what can we learn from this? How is violence to be confronted? Here are some questions: the why, who, how, and for what, right? Why? You must confront violence when you see it. Standing in front of violence and claiming to be neutral is to take the side of the oppressor, right? You have to confront violence. You cannot be neutral. Identity absolutely matters. The people who argue against it are most fiercely are the people who are most committed to identity politics, but it's white politics, right? So they say it's not about identity politics. By the way, this doesn't mean that if you are a white cis man who is affluent, straight, etc., you have no role in this. You absolutely do. In fact, we, you, me, have the greatest responsibility. We have to hold each other accountable. We have the greatest responsibility precisely because these forms of oppression are meant to benefit us above all else. Here are some dimensions of social change: personal to structural, some ways to think about it. Grassroots and institutional. The easiest type of actions, which you should be taking, but also the most difficult, which are probably the most effective, right? If you want to make social change, the most disruptive type of actions are the ones that work best, right? If you shut down the economic system, you put in much more pressure than if you stand on the sidewalk with a sign. Also, I want to talk about self-criticism versus lukewarm allyship, right? Stop calling yourself an ally. It's not enough to wear a shirt that says, I'm an ally, Black Lives Matter, etc. I think it's cool, it's part of the resistance, right? But more importantly than that, it is to be self-critical and to think really hard about where we stand on this fight and how we are maybe beneficiaries of this violence. And it doesn't matter who you are. If you're in this room, we're beneficiaries of global imperialism, right? So we have to think about that. In different ways, we're all beneficiaries as long as we're in a place like this. So my answer is just this: don't be neutral in the face of injustice. We're all implicated in this, and we don't have much time. Thank you very much. I went a little bit long, but I can come back to anything, and yeah, I'm just really looking forward to your comments. Thank you very much.
I have a magic speaking technology.
And no time to waste.
Hello, well, my name is Maite. I think you kind of went over this about the Aztecs and Incas back in the time. How do you think that, that movement has impacted today's movement? And how can we relate back to it, to the effects and the cause?
Nice, yeah. So in really complicated ways, right? Because on the one hand, we have to start with, what did the Spanish encounter? When the Spanish and the Portuguese came to the Americas, they encountered highly advanced, complex societies that had poetry and political thought, right, political theory, and drama and plays, and they had surgery and medicine and universities and zoos, right, where they were investigating all kinds of things. They didn't find uncivilized people who needed to be evangelized and saved, right? But the way we've constructed that history is there were these savages who, were weak, so they were taken over by a stronger, powerful empire from the outside. So part of what I think animates indigenous movements today is trying to recover, despite this epistemic violence that has displaced their own history, to try to recover their own strength and to see we were really great, right? And our greatness has been totally dismantled and shut down and suppressed and discounted. Yeah, so that's one approach to an answer to your question, which is great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so in the past I've advocated against ICE, and I had a friend approach me who told me that she studies this kind of thing in college, and that the purpose of ICE is not to detain illegal immigrants, but illegal immigrants who have committed crimes in their country who are seeking refuge in another country. But if ICE is called, let's say, to like an illegal immigrant bus to a place where there are legal immigrants that aren't criminals, they do have to detain them. So what is the purpose of ICE? What do they do? Is it just illegal immigrants? Is it legal immigrants who have committed crimes? What is it?
Yeah, so this is a great question because the narrative is they're only going after the dangerous criminals, not, the average person who just lives in your community. But if you look at the statistics of the people who are being detained, the vast majority, more than 90%, haven't committed any crimes at all. Their only mistake was to come across this border without papers, seeking a better life for their families.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, that's a really concise answer, but we can talk about it more. Yeah, look at the data. What else? See, now I'm glad I went over, because no one's talking. Yeah, please.
Hi, okay, so mine is backing off of her question a little, well, mostly actually, but I was wondering your thoughts on how much can you blame people for the time period that they lived in, especially for the people that came and colonized the Americas. So like ethnocentrism was so crazy strong back then, like can we really blame them for their time?
Yeah. Okay, so when we're talking about the people who came as colonizers, that might be going so far that there's maybe greater strength to the argument. When we're talking about, you can't blame the founding fathers of this country, for example, for owning slaves because they were people of their time. I think then especially, we have all kinds of historical records of people who were abolitionists at that time, right? So to say they were just people of their time, one, erases the people who were on the right side of history even then, right? And it excuses them for not being on the right side of history even then, when there were people who already knew, right? People already knew that it was a problem to own other people. So yeah, that's my argument against that. You have to understand them as people of their time. There were people at that time who knew better, right? So we have to remember them and not excuse it. What?
I wondered about your wording a bit.
Yeah.
So you could frame most of it also in terms of power structures, and I would be rather interested why you choose the violence and justice rather than power and countering powers. Because you seem to be, or you surely are very keen on like structuralism and discourse theory and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, good. So I'm not saying that this isn't about power and contention, right? Because politics is about power and contention, and this is all deeply political. But it's also damaging, and that's where I'm coming from, right? These are forms of damage. Structural, embodied, everyday, subtle, physical, discursive, symbolic. These are things that cause damage. So it's not just politics and power and contention, but also injury, and damage, and pain, and trauma. Right? So that's what I'm trying to point out. But it's not just about, there are people on this side and they're fighting against people on this side, and they're like, every once in a while they vote, and these people win every once in a while, and then these people win every once in a while. No, it's more like there was real damage being made through these politics and this power and contention. And there still is, right? It's not in the past. Thank you.
I don't need the microphone, thank you. I was curious as to why you decided to set up your presentation in a way where you fed so many different movements separately, but then in the end say they all tie together.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is that I wanted to give you kind of a breadth of the social movements around, but also not leave you thinking that they're operating on separate tracks, because your life is not operating on separate tracks. It's not how reality operates, right? So I'm kind of setting you up and hoping that you were already mad at me for presenting it as separate tracks, but only to give you the punchline at the end. This is maybe the wrong way to think about it, but these are identity movements, and they're focused on, indigenous peoples are focused on indigenous things, but there are also indigenous feminists, for example.
And for the record, the broad overview, the impossibly broad overview task, that was about doing.
Not impossible. I got it in 45 minutes.
Nice one, Joe.
So this might be completely off the topic, but like I'm a psych major and a Latin American minor. So I'm wondering, like, what is your advice? What do you think you can do with that major and minor? What are some ideas that you've seen throughout your years that you've been working with other students?
Yeah, I think that combination will make you a really strong analyst of these kinds of powerful or power and contention issues that are becoming more and more relevant, right? So you could do a lot of things with that. You could be a writer, you have research skills, you develop critical thinking as through your liberal arts education. You can put that to work for research, journalism. You could go work for Samantha Bee or Trevor Noah, right, and do research for them. They need researchers as well, right, and good writers. And people who know about these issues historically and not just like the business side of it. Yeah, so you can do anything. I mean, it really depends on what you're interested in, and I'm happy to ask you some more questions that might help us to think about where you want to go, but definitely dream big and backwards plan. Have a big dream, and then think about what you need to do each step from there, right, to get to that next thing. So like, if you're here, what would I need to do to get there? I would have to, if I want to run for president, right, you need to have like the support from donors and from the party to do that, right? How do you get the support from donors and from the party? You start building your name, right? So if you start backwards planning, it's much more available to you to reach your dream than if you graduate and you're like, okay, now what I do? I'm gonna float around and get an internship and then see where that takes me, because that's a much more tenuous path, right? So dream big and then backwards plan.